we were shaped by evolution to see truly those aspects of reality that were important for our fitness. So those who see reality more accurately have a better chance of reproduction than those who don't. In that process, we discovered that the truth was systematically going extinct when it competed against certain kinds of participants that weren't seeing the truth. You can think about evolutionary game theory, which is the mathematical model of Darwin's theory, as game theory. And if you're playing a game, you're trying to get enough points to, for example, beat your competitors or get to the next level of a game without dying and so forth if it's a video game. And it's similar in evolution. You're competing for fitness payoffs, and those are the points. The fitness payoffs are the points. If you get more fitness payoffs than your competition, then you don't go to the next level of the game, but your offspring do. Your genes go into the next generation. So the fitness payoffs themselves need to have, at least tacitly, information about the truth. So we ask the technical question: what is the probability that a randomly chosen fitness payoff will have information about some structures in the world? The answer is the probability is 0.
So this podcast is called First Principles First Podcast. It's an attempt to understand a science of intelligence, of conscious agents, of life, minds, on a first principle basis. And so a lot of the motivation for these interviews is really to identify different kinds of first principles based on the science, not just a sort of technology, but a science, and drawing heavily on neuroscience, biology, physics, and computational cognition models, that kind of thing. And what we're trying to do is develop a scientific framework, a computational framework, for the design of computationally conscious, self-aware agents that can be applied to a variety of applications. I mean, in finance and economics, governance, climate change. And it's a very different perspective than the current perspective on AI and AGI. I mean, I think if you look at the current model, and what they're looking at is they see intelligence as ability to solve complex tasks. Superintelligence does this better than anything else. And so it's really part of the older paradigm, I would argue. It comes from an engineering paradigm, an objectivist paradigm, it's a reductionist paradigm. And as such, I think it misses some of the key points and is a misdirection of resources. So this is sort of unique in the sense that we are actually feeling, going back to first principles, this notion of observer, observed, and consciousness becomes really critical to the design of computational agents. So that is sort of where we're headed. And just to get a little background on myself, I'm the host. I've been involved in this journey for a very long time, going back into the 70s. The MIT AI lab. I did a book on a computational model of cognition and discourse, psychoanalytic discourse, inferring it from text. And then I did a number of startup companies in natural language processing, but the whole area itself was pretty moribund for quite a while. It really was. It was not going anywhere. I don't think, my view, computational linguistics is going anywhere. And then suddenly we had these breakthroughs, both in science and technology. And I think we're in a very, very different place. And I do think we're moving towards a different kind of scientific paradigm. In a Kuhnian sense, we're shifting to a different way of thinking about things. It hasn't established itself. I think if you take that new paradigm and you apply it to our legal system, our governance system, it's a very, very different way of looking at ourselves. So this is an attempt to sort of lay the ground and the foundation. And I'd like to express my deepest gratitude and excitement in having Don Hoffman on this. I mean, he exemplifies the totally interdisciplinary approach. You're a cognitive scientist, but you're a mathematician, a physicist, a biologist. You touch all those fields, and you do it in a way that goes back to first principles. And so I really value that. And given the fact that there's such a rich area, I'd like to sort of outline so that my idea of what might be some topics we can approach to actually get these ideas across. And I'd like to start with your book, the 2020 book, The Case Against Reality, How Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. A very provocative title, to say the least. But you had developed the notion of how fitness beats truth theorem. And I think that's a foundational concept. And there's some questions I have around that. And then you go to your notion of interface theory perception, and then you go to the space-time is doomed. These are like breaking with the orthodoxies. And then you have a certain argument about universal Darwinism, and I'm interested in how that relates. I'll give it, let me show my hand here, to the free energy principle or to Susskind's concept of the second law of complexity, which I think is quite relevant to some of the points that you're making in your last paper. So part of that then is go from your book into your paper that you did with Chris and others, I think, on conscious agent networks, the formal analysis, application, cognition. And then from that, I think your paper on Markov kernels and the concept of positive geometry and observer theory. I think this is really intriguing and deep. I know some influence. Yours and Chris' work is very intertwined. His influence, Carl's. I'm interested in you cite Stephen Wolfram a lot, and I know you've been on a podcast and he writes about this. I'm interested to see how your two perspectives mesh or don't mesh. And then finally, if we have, I'm really, you brought up the notion that Dawkins said, well, there should be a science of theology. Okay, what would that look like? What might that be? I mean, but so that's sort of the rough outline. You can say, well, that's crazy, I don't want to do that, or we can follow this general outline. It's up to you, Tom, if it makes sense.
Sounds good. I just put one proviso. I'm only a cognitive scientist. I'm not a mathematician or a physicist.
No, I know you don't, but you exemplify understanding of those different fields, and you do weave them together, and it's that transdisciplinary. That it's not often common in these various disciplines.
Yeah, I have wonderful collaborators who make up my lack in those areas and help me along. So Chetan Prakash and Manish Singh and Robert Prentner and others. So many thanks to them.
Well, that's a really interesting point about how to do this research. I mean, how you need teams of collaboration. I know you had a lot of people in the mathematics department at Berkeley working with you. And so, but be able to translate across the different fields and then focus on is I think a really important skill given the complexity where we are. So can we start with your book and what you think is sort of the really salient points of that and what you were trying to make and how that became a foundation for a lot of your other work is built upon that, if I'm correctly inferring that?
Right. So the case against reality is a deep dive into evolution and what it means about our perceptions. And most of us understand that evolution says that we've been shaped to be fit. Evolution shapes our sensory systems to help us, live long enough to reproduce successfully. So they're there to help us in the tasks of life: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and mating. And most of us assume, okay, sure, that makes sense. And surely one of the ways that evolution has shaped our senses to help us to be fit is they've shaped our senses to show us aspects of reality, truly, those aspects that we need. Of course, no one thinks we see all of reality. We know that that's not the case. But surely we were shaped by evolution to see truly those aspects of reality that were important for our fitness. So those who see reality more accurately have a better chance of reproduction than those who don't. That's sort of the assumption. And we know that there are going to be shortcuts. Evolution does things fast and cheap, right? If you spend too many calories on things, that's not good. So evolution is going to try to do things cheaply. And if you spend too much time, right, if it takes you half an hour to figure out that that's a lion in front of you, that's not good because you're already dead. So we need to do things quickly. So everybody understands that probably there are some heuristics, but in general, we're going to be pretty close to the truth where we need it. So I decided to just look into that because some work I've been doing in vision suggested that it's largely a visual construction, and we have all these rules for constructing, and I began to suspect that maybe something different was going on here. So I worked with a number of graduate students. I'll mention Brian Marion and Justin Mark, and Chetan Prakash, who is a colleague, and others. And the bottom line is this: we first started off doing evolutionary games just to see what would happen, right? So we could put organisms competing against each other, some that saw the truth in our little worlds and others that didn't. and we could start to play with it. And in that process, we discovered that the truth was systematically going extinct when it competed against certain kinds of participants that weren't seeing the truth. And we, doing the games, we realized some deep principles that seemed to be going on. So then I worked with Chetan Prakash, and we were able to turn those into presumed theorems that we then proved. And the bottom line is this: evolution is, you can think about evolutionary game theory, which is the mathematical model of Darwin's theory, as game theory. And if you're playing a game, you're trying to get enough points to, for example, beat your competitors or get to the next level of a game without dying and so forth if it's a video game. And it's similar in evolution. You're competing for fitness payoffs, and those are the points. The fitness payoffs are the points. And in evolutionary theory, if you get more fitness payoffs than your competition, then you don't go to the next level of the game, but your offspring do. Your genes go into the next generation. So that's why you can think about it in terms of video games and so forth. And just a little modification is you don't go to the next level, your genes go to the next level. So in that sense, you can then look at different strategies and see which ones are most likely to succeed. Well, so the strategy of seeing the truth, if for that strategy to evolve, the fitness payoffs, the point, the things that give you the points in the game, they would have to have some information about the truth, right? They can't tell you, yes, you're seeing the truth, unless they actually know that you're seeing the truth. So the fitness payoffs themselves need to have, at least tacitly, information about the truth. And so we ask the technical question: what is the probability that a randomly chosen fitness payoff will have information about some structures in the world? Like, mathematically, there'd be things like metrics or topologies or partial orders or total orders, whatever it might be. And in each case, the answer is the probability is 0. If I give you 1 million randomly chosen payoff functions, maybe one of them will have information about the truth. But the other 999,000 and so forth won't. It's basically, and when you go to the limit, it's precisely probability 0.
What now? How does that compare to sort of the Freudian notion of making predictions and sampling and being able to you're not just playing a game. You're trying to get build a better model of the world that you're in, and this gets into the good regulator theorem, the idea that to exist is have a more complete model of something. It's not necessarily a particular fitness strategy. I mean, particularly if it's not all zero sum. I mean, this gets into E.O. Wilson's notion of multi-level selection, cooperative, that there's certain things that have a second order, third order effects that actually affect your collective outcome, and that's not all about just maximizing your own utility. So it was interesting how
those things are all good. And there's no problem, no contradiction, because we're going to say, yes, evolution is successfully shaping organisms to survive and reproduce and do all these, maintain their Markov boundaries and all that stuff. So predictive processing is working just fine and so forth. The question is, when you do the predictive processing, when you actually maintain your Markov boundaries and so forth, is one consequence of that process that you evolve to see the truth? And the answer is almost surely not.
And what do you mean by truth in that sense? What when you have used the word truth, what do you mean by that?
So yeah, because one objection might be, Don, if you can't tell us what the truth is a priori, then how do you know that we're not seeing it, right? So we don't know what the truth is, but what we can say is, suppose the whatever reality is, it had a particular structure, say a metric or a topology, or so there you can just list a bunch of natural structures that you might think, and you can ask, okay, given modern evolutionary game theory, what is the probability that a randomly chosen fitness payoff function would be a homomorphism, say, of the metric or of a topology? So if the payoff function isn't a homomorphism of that for that structure, then it doesn't contain information about that structure, and it can't possibly shape an organism to know that structure. So suppose it's the truth is that there is this metric, this distance metric. What's the chance that I'll be able to see that kind of distance, say, in my visual perception? Well, 0 if the payoff functions that are shaping my sensory system have no information about that metric. Now, they can still shape me to succeed in the game of life, which is to reproduce before I die, at least reproduce more than my offspring. So I can succeed at that, but I won't know the truth. And so here's the insight that, or the metaphor that really sort of makes all of this make sense. Because right now everything I'm saying might seem so strange and bizarre, but here's the bottom line. Evolution shaped you to have a headset, a VR headset, to play the game of life. So that's the analogy that I think really helps bring this thing home. Suppose that you think about this analogy, I'm playing a VR game, but the reality in this metaphor is some supercomputer somewhere with, billions of voltages, and they have to be all, toggled into precise order to play the game. Now, if I knew the truth and we're trying to play the game by playing with the truth, I'd have to toggle those billions of voltages in the precise order very, very quickly and faster than my competition that just had a VR headset on. Well, good luck with that, because the guy with the VR headset just has a little steering wheel, says Grand Theft Auto or something like that. He's got a steering wheel, a dashboard, brakes, and a gas pedal, and he can do something very simple that controls those voltages in the right order, but he doesn't have to know about that. And so that's what evolution did. It gave us a VR headset that lets us play the game of life, and it frees us from knowing all the details of the hardware underneath it.
Are you familiar with Andreas Wagner's stuff on Arrival of the Fittest at Zurich? He's at Santa Fe in Zurich. He talks about these things, and he calls hidden beauties and things about how things and how does that relate to some of his arguments, where he talks about adjacency and the likelihood of things coming up.
Well, we're going to have that. There's a vast fitness space to search here now, right? And there's, as you can see by looking around in nature, there is not one solution. So, for example, many humans will have the solution of, I'm going to have just one or two or a handful of kids at most, and I'm going to invest in them really, really heavily. And in each one of them is very, very precious. I've invested it. Or I can be a spider, and I'll have, several hundred offspring, and I'll eat a few of them. If I'm hungry, I'll eat a few of them. But the rest, hey, they're on their own too. So, watch out for mom, because mom might eat you. But since I'm having hundreds of them, I'm going to also be successful in reproduction. So there's no one right way. So when we talk about truth, we're not saying that there's, and we're not seeing the truth. We're not saying that there's one truth, and we have to do it that one way to succeed in evolution. No, there are many, many strategies.
I mean, there's a lot of things. It's what I call sleeping Buddhists. You don't know they're there until something happens, and suddenly they work. And there seems to be a lot of redundancy. It's not junk DNA. It's actually, it's just a lot of redundancy, that you have many metabolic paths available. Yeah.
That's right. And so it gives you the flexibility if nature throws some curveball at you, climate change, for example. Many species will go extinct, but not all. So again, as long as not everything doesn't go extinct, if you have a few, then you can carry on. But if everything goes extinct, then it's game over. This is all in Darwin's theory. So yes, you need to have some flexibility, but there are some organisms like E. coli where they have very, very fixed action patterns and very no investment in intelligence. They have simple things, but what they do is they reproduce like mad, right? And then they die like mad too. So
and the numbers. It's a numbers game.
It's a numbers game. That's right. So Darwin's theory, when you look at it, our intuitions that organisms would in general be shaped to see reality as it is, or at least some organisms would be shaped to see reality as it is. It turns out that intuition, which, by the way, I deeply held too. I mean, it just seems, I just assume I see the truth. I see the sun and the moon. I'm seeing what really was there for billions of years before I was even here. That's the way it seems to us. But we have to take our scientific theories seriously. I'm not saying that our scientific theories are true. I mean, part of understanding how to get to the next level of our scientific theories, though, is to take our current theories seriously, push them to their limits, and ask, what do they really tell us? And what evolution is telling us, Darwin's theory is telling us from evolutionary game theory, the mathematical formulation of it, is the probability is zero that any of our perceptions of shape, depth, time, motion, color are true. They're all user interface symbols that help us play the game of life. So here's the way I would then sort of summarize this. Darwin told us that our sensory systems were shaped to guide adaptive behavior. And that's right. Evolutionary theory entails our sensory systems were shaped to guide adaptive behavior. And all I'm doing is putting a period on that. Period. Seeing the truth is not needed to guide adaptive behavior. And so Darwin was right. I'm not changing Darwin, whatever. What I'm saying is that everybody else has added something to Darwin. They've said, aha, well, we see the truth. That's how our sensory systems guide adaptive behaviors. They show us the truth. Now, I should say there are a number of philosophers who don't like this and who've published in journals and elsewhere, basically saying I've shot myself in the foot logically. And the gist of the argument is Darwin talked about physical organisms like people and giraffes and so forth in a physical space-time, competing for physical resources like food and water. And so I'm using evolutionary game theory, which is a mathematizing of Darwin's ideas, to show that things like physical objects in space and time are not objective reality, they're just headset. And so, in some sense, I've used a mathematical model of Darwin's own theory to disconfirm some of the key foundational concepts in Darwin's theory. And so the argument goes, that's bad science, right? The scientist puts down these key foundational concepts for their theory. You mathematize them. And then your mathematics comes back and says those key foundational concepts cannot be fundamental. And so a number of philosophers have said, wrong, and you've shot yourself in the foot, and you need to understand a little bit of philosophy on this. And my reply is, no, that's how science works. So here's, like ABCs of science. Every scientific theory says, please, grant me these assumptions. If you grant me, and I'm not explaining these assumptions like Einstein, his theory of relativity, special theory. Let me assume that the speed of light is universal for all observers, please. And let me assume that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial frames. If you grant me those two assumptions, I'm not explaining those assumptions, I'm asking you to grant me those assumptions, then I will give you the Lorentz transformations, I will give you, eventually we got Minkowski space, we got quantum field theory, at least the space-time part of quantum field theory coming out of that and so forth. So every theory is like that. Every scientific theory says, grant me these assumptions. And of course, these assumptions are going to have the foundational concepts. Though that's where you're putting down your assumptions and your foundational concepts. Now, a good theory, so what that means is no scientific theory could ever be a theory of everything because it's not a theory of its assumptions. It's just as obvious as ABC. That means every theory on the face of it is of limited scope. A good theory gives you the mathematical tools to explore the power of its scope. A great theory gives you the mathematical tools to tell you the limits of its very foundational concepts. That's how science works. And in Einstein's case, it's his own mathematics, together with some other mathematics from quantum theory, that tells us that Einstein's foundational concept of space and time, or space-time, cannot be fundamental. It falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So here we have a case where Einstein's own foundational concepts are put into mathematics by Einstein himself, and that mathematics tells us that those concepts could not be the final word, and of course they couldn't be the final word. No scientific theory could ever be the final word. So I'm just doing what's the pedestrian ABCs of how science works, and then getting shot at from all sides because I'm presumably doing something that's logically, shooting myself in the foot. So it's just to be very, very clear. There is no scientific theory of everything. Every theory has a scope and limits. The question is your theory precise enough and great enough to actually tell you its limits? If not, well, we need a deeper theory. Now, the next step, of course, is once you've found the limits of the scope of one theory, like Einstein's theory of space-time, then you want to, as a scientist, you need to take the next step, right? You want to go beyond, for example, the limits of that theory, beyond space-time. Well, Einstein's theory can't tell you where to go, right? It's a theory of space-time, so it doesn't give you so there. That's the fun of science, and that's what usually the next generation does, right? The younger generation, they're the ones that get to overthrow the concepts of their elders, and they have a great deal of fun doing it, right? Where they now take the leap beyond the old set of concepts, and that's a leap. But the old theories get their due, because whatever you propose, for example, outside of space-time, you have to project it back into space-time, and you better get the answers inside space-time that we already know, or you have some explaining to do. Maybe you can have some. Maybe you can explain and give a deeper framework for why there are, like Einstein showed he could project down to Newton, but he made changes to Newton, and he could explain why those changes were important to Newton. So you have to do that. So whatever step the next theory takes, the older theories are there pretty much to give a thumbs down, right? They can't tell you you're right, but they can surely tell you you're probably wrong. And of course, most of our ideas are wrong. So that's what I'm doing with evolutionary theory. I'm saying, in some sense, to summarize this, Einstein's theory tells us that space and time, and therefore objects inside space and time, cannot be fundamental. And I'm just saying Darwin agrees. Darwin agrees. His own theory tells us that space and time and objects in space and time cannot be fundamental. And those are our two greatest theories, evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory, put it that way, are big theories right now. And they both tell us it's over for space-time and objects inside space-time. As the physicists, high energy theoretical physicists put it, space-time is doomed. Darwin agrees.
So, but then again, you have you're under an obligation to explain things within a space-time context, and therein is the part of the challenge, right? I mean, and I guess what you're arguing, I mean, is if space-time is not fundamental, then what is fundamental? And you talk about sort of a material physical realism. As an older convention, and you're saying no, that it's not what I call it a conscious realism, an information realism. There's something more foundational than that. And I think this leads to your other work. Could you elaborate on that and how that works? And then I think if I understand what you did in your last paper is you try to come around again and put it within a space-time context. And one of the things we're interested in is how do you design conscious agents so they have certain characteristics then those are going to be in space-time. And someone would say, well, do you really need to be concerned with that? Because that's very abstract. It's not. And they said, no, actually, that's fundamental to be able to understand what it is. And so that's where I'm led on this, because when you talk to certain people, they say, well, you're getting into the whole quantum information. Why do you need to do that?
Right, exactly. No, absolutely. So first on the physical realism, because I think most people just take physical realism as the obvious default, and if you're not doing that, what's the matter with your head? So I just want to point out that when we say space-time is doomed, that means the particles inside space-time are doomed. Particles, the high-energy physicists will tell us, are nothing but what they call irreducible representations of the Poincare group of space-time. So you give me your space-time and its symmetries, I will tell you the particles, and that is the foundation for the entire reductive buildup that we give, to atoms, molecules, neurons, and brains, and so forth. So this, if space-time is doomed, that makes a clean prediction. We should not be able to give a physicalist reductionist account of our consciousness. And I'm good. I mean, this is an area that I'm very interested in. I'm good friends with most of the big players, have been for decades, and they're brilliant. They're colleagues and friends. They're brilliant. And if it could be done, they would have done it. And right now, I mean, in a very gentle, friendly way in my talks, I start my talks by saying we have roughly 1 trillion different conscious experiences that we can experience: the taste of chocolate, the smell of mint, the color red, whatever it might be. There's about 1 trillion of them that we can experience. So it should be, all these physicalist theories of consciousness it's like shooting fish in a barrel. Pick one. Give me your theory, integrated information theory account, or global workspace account, or collapse of neuronal microtubules, collapse theory, whatever your theory is, pick some conscious experience, give me your mathematical model of it, and explain why that must be the taste of mint. And so I say, okay, so how many have you got? And I put a big 0 on the screen. We have 0. Now, if space-time is doomed, then it makes sense why the big 0 was going to stay there. And it does not impugn the intelligence of these people. They're brilliant. It cannot be done. The reason that they're not getting it is not that they're dumb. They're brilliant. Some of them are geniuses. You just can't start inside space-time and build up consciousness. So what is outside of space-time? Well, the right answer is I don't know. But as a scientist, it's my job to make a hypothesis that's testable. And so my hypothesis is I'm going to start with what I call consciousness. Conscious experiences like the taste of chocolate, the smell of garlic, and so forth, and probabilistic relationships among conscious experiences. That's what I'm going to start with. So we published a few papers, again, with some collaborators, notably Chetan Prakash and Robert Prentner. And we have some physicists now working with us for the next one coming up. And so the idea then is we have a Markovian dynamics of conscious agents. So think of it as a vast social network, like the Twitterverse. But each of these little agents mathematically is quite simple. Each agent has the set of experiences that it can have. Like maybe this agent only has one. I can only experience red. That's all I experience, a particular color red or red and green. So, and then I can go up to ones that have billions or trillions or however, so they can build up. You can build up to, so we have these little teeny agents, like atomic agents, all the way up to as big as you want, infinite agents. And so the Markov kernels could be, for the one experience agent, it's just it's a 1-by-1 matrix. It's just what a Dirac kernel, right? If it's test 2, then it's a 2-by-2 Markovian matrix for in some sense of probability if I experience red now that I'm experiencing green next and so forth. Now there are behind that matrix there are these matrices because each agent is now interacting with others. My experience has a probabilistic effect on the transitions of the other agents and their experiences. But what we can do, the nice thing about Markov kernels is if you have a bunch of Markov kernels in this process, you can multiply them all together and turn it into one kernel. So that's what I'm doing here when I say I just have a little 2-by-2 kernel. I can sort of take this whole infinite matrix set of matrices and look down at each guy and turn him into a little 2-by-2, 5-by-5, whatever his experiences are, and analyze him. So that's what we're starting with, is this theory of Markov chains outside of spacetime. And so
can I just ask a question? So when you talk about being able to multiply multiple Markov kernels and you get a single one, I mean, is that? I mean, there's a whole interest of and Carl writes about in Michael Levin, how you have different agents and how they can come together to form more complex agents, and Chris will talk about this, how this is the same above as below, the kind of the principal ways of how they. Is this a way of dealing with is this a similar kind of issue here that you're talking? It strikes me as that this is like a very principled way of understanding that, if I understand it correctly.
It's one important tool for it, but it's not the only tool. In the paper we're writing right now, we have a brand new tool that we just discovered this year that is actually showing how to combine agents at all levels. It's a mathematical logic of conscious agent, but it's actually a contribution to the mathematics of Markov chains. So this is the first time, if you give me the space of all possible Markovian kernels on any number of states, n goes from 1 to infinity, I can give you a partial order on the entire space of Markovian kernels, the entire space, and it tells you which kernels are compatible and combine to create a higher level kernel and which ones cannot. So I can actually tell you the definition. If you know one thing, I can tell you the definition in one sentence and the whole thing. So if you have a big kernel, and say on 10 states, say 10 colors, and it's a 10-by-10 matrix, right? So it's got 100 entries in it. That's telling you if I see red now, what's probability you'll see green next, and so forth. Now suppose that that's the kernel that's in charge. That's what's governing the probabilities. But then I only look at three of the colors, just maybe red, green, and blue. So I'm only paying attention to them. The big kernel will induce a new 3 by 3 kernel on those three, okay? And it'll be a unique kernel that's entailed. It's called the trace. This is called the trace chain. And here's the logic, all in one sentence. One kernel entails another if it's a trace of the other. That's it. That's the big idea. Wow. And that gives you a partial order on the entire space of Markov kernels. It gives you the notion of disjunction, conjunction. It gives you an entire non-Boolean logic, and it tells you how to combine kernels, and therefore, because we're dealing with using those to model consciousness, it's our model of how consciousness combines, and when consciousnesses are incompatible. And for those sort of have New Age ideas about spirits combine if they have the right vibes and so forth.
Yeah, vibe.
Well,
right.
This turns out to give mathematical beef to it. It actually, the vibes are going to be, you have to have exactly the right traces. If you have the same trace on the states that you overlap, if your vibes are right, then you can combine into a higher consciousness. And the higher consciousness turns out to have higher energy. The bigger Markov has
higher energy.
Literally has higher energy.
Yes.
So all the stuff that's been said intuitively and hand wavy, we can put precise stuff. Now, by the way, I wasn't trying to do that. It was only after the fact that we go, oh, okay, yeah, that language is pointing but this is what it's pointing to.
Well, that's tricky to get that across. I mean,
yeah, if you don't understand the notion of a trace chain,
you're breaking. Yeah. Now that's really, really interesting. So, I mean, because one of the things we're looking at in a whole nother setting is how do you get alignment among different parties, and how do you get higher levels of shared Bayesian beliefs, and what is necessary for getting that alignment to have a common belief. And what you're saying is you cannot calculate the trace, and you can see some way of that happening. Can you have a way of having realigning, changing traces in order to get? I mean, this ties into a very practical thing we're looking at. Is sort of you have such divides and opinions in this country, and how do you have different alignments, different traces, different energy levels? How do you? Is it just those differences going to exist, or is there potential of a mathematics of alignment to create a higher energy potential?
Well, there is, but let me just first say something about the first thing you said, which is about the Bayesian inference kinds of things. It turns out that if you have a Markov kernel that's a recurrent communicating class, it will have a long-term probability measure called the stationary measure, which describes the long-term probability of being in each state. And it turns out that there is a logic on probability measures that's homomorphic to the logic on Markov kernels that I just talked about. So there's the logic on probability measures is called the Lebesgue logic. So that's a logic that I published with two mathematicians. We prove in this paper that we're writing right now that the mapping that takes a Markovian kernel to a stationary measure is a homomorphism of these two logics. And the Bayes rule turns out to be a special case of the meet of the Lebesgue logic. So this Lebesgue logic on probability measures includes Bayes rule as a special case of its meet. And so what we have is now these beautiful mathematical structures that are very simply, and by the way, the Lebesgue logic has a very, very simple definition as well. One probability measure entails another if it's a normalized restriction. That's it. So one kernel entails another if it's a trace. One probability measure entails another if it's a normalized restriction. Those give you these incredibly powerful logics, and the map from a kernel to its stationary measure is a homomorphism of the logic. So we're actually proposing this logic of Markovian kernels as a logic of observation. So this is our notion of what it means to be an observer. A Markovian dynamical system observes another if it's a trace of the other. And what that means is you can only observe what you are an organic component of. You have to be an organic component of the thing to observe it at all. That's the new theory, the new deep idea that comes out of this. And we're quite excited because I think that we're working now to show that this is what quantum mechanics has been needing for a long time, right? Quantum mechanics for almost 100 years now has had a problem with measurement, right? When you're not looking, there's the Schrodinger evolution, which is unitary, linear, but unitary. And the nastiness is that every time you make a measurement, it's intractably nonlinear. It's non-unitary, and they have not been able for a century to give a theory of measurement because there's no reduction of a nonlinear process to a unitary process. You just can't do it. And so we're offering a theory of observation. And what we want to do now in this paper is take the first steps in showing that we can actually start to predict things. So in this paper, we're actually showing that we can get the wave function of the free particle as a projection of our theory outside of space. So these are conscious agents outside of space-time. They're going to project down to space-time, and we're going to say that certain properties of the Markovian dynamics, in this particular case, it looks like recurrent communicating classes and certain other communicating classes, that what we call particles in space-time are projections of these recurrent communicating classes of Markovian dynamics. And so then and I can tell you why we came to that conclusion. It's really interesting how we got to that conclusion. But then once we got that conclusion, then we said, now we have to take properties of the recurrent communicating classes and ask what properties of those could project to momentum, position, energy, and spin, and so forth. And it turns out the answers look pretty straightforward. So the determinant is going to project to the spin. The entropy rate of the kernel is going to project to the mass. The number of asymptotic sets is going to project to the momentum, and so forth. So it's just like, so it's pretty. So there's a lot of work ahead, but right now the initial hookups are looking pretty interesting and pretty fun.
You did do a session with Stephen Wolfram on this, and I think we remember, and you were trying to explain it to him. And I was trying to think sort of where that was going. And you do cite some of his work on observation. So how do you articulate your view on the theories of observation and what he's talking about? I mean, it also shows up in Michael Levin's work too. I mean, I think this idea of cells as observing one another. I mean, it's a really profound departure from our conventional way of thinking about things. And I just wonder the extent to which what you described is shared or understood actually by a number of people exploring the same space.
Well, Mike and I are good friends. Mike Levin and I are good friends, and we've known each other for many, many years. And we have conversations periodically. We have some that are on podcasts, so you can see them online. So Mike is very interested in these kinds of ideas. Of course, he's very interested in Carl Friston's ideas and so forth. And we can talk a little bit about the relationship of those. But with Wolfram, the interesting thing that I think came out of my discussion with Stephen was that Stephen is very interested in what he calls the Ruliad, which is in some sense the space of all possible rules. And I really pressed him in our conversation on the point of, do you think that the rules are fundamental and somehow give rise to consciousness, or is consciousness prior to the rules? And I won't put words in his mouth. I'll just tell you my impression of what my impression. He's hoping that the rules are fundamental.
That was my take. That was my take. Yeah,
that's my take too. But I won't put words in his mouth. So that's Hoffman's understanding of Stephen Wolfram, and I may be wrong. But once again, we have had no success and no evidence that there's any chance of success at starting with unconscious ingredients and booting up consciousness. And Leibniz, in his book The Monadology, about 300 years ago, over 300 years ago, looked at physicalist reductionist points of view. And of course, he was eminently qualified. He was one of the most brilliant scientists of all time, even to this day, and mathematicians. And for him, it was so obvious that one paragraph was enough. All he needed was one physicalist reductionism. Nah, one paragraph, that's gone, and he moves on. And I think that Leibniz is right, but we've taken 3 centuries to come around and realize that Leibniz knew it all along. And in some sense, what you could say is that look, Leibniz proposed this notion of monads, and probably his ideas are much, much deeper than mine, but might humbly suggest that our theory of conscious agents might be a mathematical instantiation of Leibniz ideas. I have no doubt, though, that if he were here, he would run circles around me.
We'd be all jaws, slack jaw. But what about then the monad and the idea of the holograms and when Susskind talks about holograms? And does that map into the same space?
This is really quite interesting. The holographic principle, which really comes up a lot with black holes and so forth.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yes, when he talks about black holes, but that's what is complexity, computation.
That's right. Inside the black hole, the complexity grows to its maximum. What's really interesting is our theory says that mass in space-time is a projection of the entropy rate of the communicating classes. Now, in space-time, if the mass density gets too high, space-time falls apart. You get a black hole, right? Now, in our approach, the entropy rate, it turns out entropy rate has a lot of uses in communication theory, but one of them is if the entropy rate of your source exceeds the channel capacity, the channel fails. Now, I'm saying that space-time is a headset. Space-time is not the fundamental reality. It's a headset. So there's this big dynamics of conscious agents out there, this big social network. I'm taking all the signals that are out there. I'm having to funnel them into the straw that is my little space-time headset. Well, when the entropy rates get too high, that's going to fail. And what will I see? Black holes.
Channel equivocation. That's right.
That's right. So I have a new theory of black holes. Black holes are just the headset. The entropy rate of the signals from this network of conscious agents exceeded the bandwidth of our headset, and so we have distortions. Now, so what this entails is, if we can look very, very closely at the distortions of space-time, the nature of the distortions at the black hole and near the black hole, we may be able to get some clue into the structure of the headset itself and the channels, the communication system. So this actually opens up. At first, it's interesting. First, in current physics, you have to put in the masses by hand. There's no theory of mass. We're proposing a theory. It's the entropy rate of these systems. And then that definition immediately says, well, that's a property of a communication system. The entropy rate of the messages coming through, and if the channel doesn't have the capacity, then you will have distortions, and we predict black. So eventually, we should be able to predict the properties of black holes as distortions of channels. So that's sort of where I'm going in terms of the relationship to black holes and that whole thing is we'll have a completely new way of thinking about black holes, completely new way, right? We have to let go of the idea that space-time is anywhere near the fundamental reality. It's not. It's just your headset. And that's going to be a huge change for us to understand what our next step in science is, to understand the first layer of software outside of our headset. What's the first layer of software outside of our headset? Of course, there's going to be probably many, many layers. This is an infinite game, but we want the first layer. And so this is a complete, right? All of science has been space-time is the truth. It's fundamental, physical object. That's what we're working with here. Now we have to say, oh, okay, we thought we were looking at the truth. Since Galileo, we've been studying our headset. In the last 10 years, high-energy theoretical physicists have taken off the headset, and I can tell you what they found. They found some new structures beyond space-time. Now I'm saying we have to really go out there and recognize space-time is not the truth. It's just a headset, and it's time to go out there and understand the first layer of software out there, reverse engineer it, and then reverse engineer our headset.
So those are the positive geometries you're talking about that's come out of that. Yes.
Yeah. So that's I'll mention just a little bit on that. So this is work completely independent of what I've been doing. It's just by the high energy theoretical physicists. They are interested in what they call scattering amplitudes. If I take two little particles like two gluons and smash them into each other and have 4 or 6 gluons spraying out, like you might do in some collider, You want to find out what's the probability of that kind of interaction and all the various kinds of particle interactions that you might. Now, when you use space-time in the standard model of physics, quantum field theory, 2 gluons in, 6 gluons out, hundreds of pages of algebra, millions of terms for one interaction. It's a mess. They discovered, Park and Taylor, some mathematicians, the experimentalists were like, we can't do this. We're going to try to do millions of particles per second. We have to do hundreds of pages out for each one to compute what we need to compute. Good, a supercomputer can't do it. So please help us. You've got to simplify. So these mathematicians, Park and Taylor, in the 1980s, got it from 100 pages down to, I don't know, like 13 or something like that. And everybody's going, holy smoke, what geniuses. They got it down. And then Park and Taylor, because they worked on it so hard, they just had this intuition, and they guessed like a 3 or 4 term thing that you could just write down on a single line, and it was right. It was like, so millions of terms get boiled down to 3 or 4 terms. And so is that a one-off? That was the question. Is this a one-off, or is this? And they started finding this happening over and over again. And then Ed Witten and his some of his postdocs in like 2005 or something like that found, for a special case, what they call N=4 super Yang-Mills, a recursion formula. It's called the BCFW recursion theory and relations, and it gives you a way to compute many of these scattering amplitudes very, very simply, instead of having hundreds of pages. So that was like this. So this is not a one-off. Nature is telling us that when we do it in space-time with quantum field theory, we're doing something very, very unnecessarily complicated. There's some deeper point of view. There's some deeper point of view here. What is it? And this guy named Alan Hodges, a British physicist, said he looked at the BCFW recursion relations and said, in certain cases, it looks like what's happening is you're putting together pieces of a volume of some geometric object, and the scattering amplitude is the volume of this object outside of spacetime, an object outside of spacetime. And so then Nima Arkani Ahmed and his collaborators said, well, let's go after that. And in 2013 they published the archive, but 2014 the paper that is what's called the amplituhedron. The amplituhedron is like the first successful positive geometry, and it is the scattering amplitudes are volumes of these amplitudes. So that was like our first step outside of space-time. We've taken the headset off, and what do we see? An obelisk. A positive geometry is just sitting there. It's a geometric object, like the amplituhedron. Now they found associahedron, cosmological polytopes, and so forth. So it's like we're like 2001: A Space Odyssey, right? Where the obelisk is there, and all the apes are pounding on it and hooting and hollering. We know it's important, but we have no clue what it means. Well, that's where we are. We took off our headset. We're seeing obelisks. We're hooting and hollering. We know it's really important, but they don't have any dynamics, right? These are just obelisks sitting there, and physics really wants dynamics. And that's what we're offering. We're saying beyond the obelisks, and beyond, by the way, behind the obelisks, they found combinatorial structures called decorated permutations that allow you to classify, to understand these objects. So there are the positive geometries, and then the decorated permutations that classify them. And what we did last year was we showed that the dynamics of conscious agents, this Markovian dynamics, can project to the combinatorics, to the decorated permutations. So that was a new piece of mathematics for Markov chains. We showed how Markov chains project to decorated permutations. And that's what told us where to look for the particles, the communicating classes, when we did that. Our current paper, we're trying to go all the way now through the positive geometries into spacetime. That's the paper we're working on right now, at least in a special case.
That's wild. To what extent then can you make predictions that can be testable predictions that can help verify what your claims are? I mean, to stand on their own in some sense.
Well, so there are certain predictions that we have to make right up front. They're sort of post-dictions that are sanity tests. So, for example, I said that we're saying that the mass is the entropy rate of the communicating class. Well, physics has a few things to say about mass, and if we don't listen to them, we're nowhere. So, for example, Einstein tells us if you say that's mass, anything that's mass 0 must travel at the speed of light. Okay, And it also has to have, quantum theory tells us, it has to have spin 1, basically. So whatever definition is forced on us from our theory of Markov chains about spin and about velocities, it all has to fit. And so I'm not smart enough to figure this stuff out. I just was looking at the communication classes and saying, there's only one thing that could possibly fit the bill of mass. It's the entropy rate. So I'm going to put that down. And then there was only one thing that could fit the bill of spin, and it's the determinant. So I'm going to put that down. There's only one thing that can fit the bill for what we call the speed, and that's the what's called the commuting times between states. And when you look at those, it works. They all come together. If you have zero entropy rate, then you turn out to be a periodic Markovian kernel. It's a periodic kernel, and those have the fastest commuting times, and they have zero mass, and they have they have determinant 1 or -1. So it all worked out, and I was not smart enough to plan this. It either worked or it didn't.
It just fell into place. It
just fell into place. Right.
That's going to be exciting. Wow.
Yes, it's pretty exciting.
Well, it's another question I have in terms of this. I mean, it was a recent experiment that's come out, and I'd be interested in your opinion on it. Roger Penrose was talking about, that his idea of quantum consciousness and microtubules, and now there's this. I'm sure you saw this recent experiment that was done with tryptophan, was being able to identify. They seem to be able to identify some kind of fluorescence or quantum state within microtubules. I mean, it's like, whoa. And I think a lot of people are sort of taking notice of that. What's your take on that?
Well, of course, Roger's brilliant, right? And when it comes to quantum mechanics,
yeah,
there's not too many people to challenge him and so forth. But on the theory of microtubules and consciousness, of course, have no doubt that we will find neural correlates and other kinds of correlates, including microtubule correlates of consciousness. The question is how to understand those correlates, right? If you're trying to understand them in a reductive framework, in which you say space-time is fundamental, and these physical systems start off without any consciousness, but if they have the right properties, then consciousness somehow emerges. Then good luck. It's not going to work. If you reply, but then Hoffman, how do you explain all of these correlations? Surely that shows that the brain causes, and these microtubules are causing. No, it doesn't at all. What we're saying is what is the brain?
Yeah.
The brain is the interface symbol that I get when I turn my headset onto the part of the network that's creating the headset.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this vast network of conscious agents out there. It's funneling down. Some of them are working together as a network to create what we call the space-time headset. I take that headset and I look at the network that's creating it. What do I see? Well, it looks like brains and neurons. Of course, we'll have neural correlates of consciousness because I'm looking at the very system of agents that created it through this headset. So it's not hard to understand why there are neural correlates of consciousness, and yet neurons are not creating it, or microtubules, quantum states are not creating it. Those are the headset projections of a much deeper reality. That's why there's correlations there.
That was my interpretation of it. I mean, I didn't see it as a vindication of a physicalist model. I thought, no, it pointed towards this interface concept.
Well, I think it does, but Roger doesn't.
I didn't know. I didn't realize that. So he took it.
Yeah, someone told Roger about my views, and Roger said so. He's more extreme than me, even. Something to that effect.
He's a physicalist in that. You're saying he's a physicalist in this?
In this regard, he seems to be wanting to say that the consciousness is not something independent.
I see.
I'm saying the consciousness entirely is prior to space-time and microtubules and quantum states. And by the way, I should say that the positive geometry work that the high-energy theoretical physicists are doing, what they say is not only that space-time is doomed, space-time is not fundamental, but quantum theory is doomed.
Yeah.
That quantum theory is not fundamental, that space-time and quantum theory together arise joined at the hip from something deeper. So the quantum entanglement of
It's not
microtubule
fundamental.
states is part of the
Part
interface.
of
It's
it.
not part of the
Okay.
deeper reality.
Where do you put Carl Friston's work in on this, and the whole free energy principle, how does that
Yeah,
fit in?
that's brilliant work. Absolutely brilliant work. And I understand that he's working in an AI company where they're using this to get to the next level of AI beyond the transformers and so forth, using the
Well, he's working
predictive
at
process.
Versus. He's also with the Stanhope AI with Rosalind Moran, and he's actually a founder of that company.
Right, right.
Yeah,
So
and
so there is a relationship, and it's this. In our Markovian dynamics of conscious agents outside of space-time, it's straightforward to write down a Markovian dynamics in which the entropy at each step is constant. So and you can write down the stationary dynamics. There is, in these Markovian dynamics, no entropic arrow of time. So in other words, we can write down dynamical systems of conscious agents not only beyond space, but beyond time. Now, it's a theorem. It's very, very straightforward. It's a three-step proof that if you have a Markovian dynamics that is, in fact, has no increasing entropy rate, no increasing entropy, if you take a projection of that dynamics, say by conditional probability, and so you get a new dynamical system, which is a projected dynamics of the original one, that new dynamical system will have increasing entropy. It will have an arrow of time. So my take is that space-time arises as an artifact of projection. The time itself is an artifact of. So our experience of time is not an insight into the deeper reality at all. It's entirely 100%, no exception. It's 100% an artifact, a distortion from the projection. Now, in evolutionary theory, the fundamental limited resource is time. If I don't breathe in time, I die. If I don't eat in time, I die. If I don't mate in time, I don't reproduce. Time is the fundamental limited resource. So what I'm saying is, first, I love Darwin's theory. Inside space and time, there's no better theory for understanding biological evolution. Having properly appreciated Darwin's theory, every aspect of it is an artifact. The limited resources, nature, red, and tooth and claw, every aspect of it is not an insight into a deeper level of reality. All of it, without exception, is 100% an artifact of projection. So that's the way science works. Darwin's theory was beautiful enough and powerful enough to say space-time isn't fundamental, but it couldn't tell us what's next. Well, what's next doesn't have to be nature, red, and tooth and claw. It could be something entirely different. Now, the reason I say all this, because you mentioned about Princeton, predictive processing is founded on time. You're predicting the future. You're maintaining you're maintaining a Markov blanket. You're maintaining a boundary based on a predictive process. All of this is an artifact of projection of something deeper that's timeless, where perhaps there is no boundaries. We don't need to worry about Markov boundaries, Markov blankets. So the idea is we can have a theory of consciousness, perhaps in which there is no nature, red, and tooth and claw. But when you take a projection of it, you will see nature, red, and tooth and claw. You will see predictive processing. You will see Markov blankets and all of that. You will see these artificial boundaries. Now, that's more than just a hand wave. What I'm saying is I should be able to take a Markovian dynamical system that's stationary and actually show precisely how predictive processing arises as a special case of the artifact of projection. So this is not a hand wave. And so after the next couple of papers we do, I want to actually go after that and say, okay, here's how predictive processing arises as a special case and why Markov blankets aren't fundamental. But if you're inside space-time and you're looking at how the headset works, there's no better framework than predictive processing. So in other words, I'm not putting this stuff down. Just like, for example, Newton. If you're going to send a rocket ship to the moon, use Newton. It's really good. It really does work. Is it the final answer? Absolutely not. The very notion of mass inside of Newton is the wrong notion of mass. Okay, so it's not the right answer. But hey, it's really, really good. And so we should really be grateful for Newton for what it can do. But Einstein is better. Well, now space-time is doomed. Well, should we just denigrate Einstein? No, no, no. It's wonderful. So each new theory, and our theory about conscious agents will be superseded. Every scientific theory will be superseded. That's just the way the game is played. So to say that I think that the predictive processing principle and the active inference and so forth is superseded by this bigger is not to put down that it has its scope.
Well, no. So how do you relate that? I mean, where does Chris's thinking come in on his quantum information theory and his whole idea of crossing boundaries and how how space time is formed through a communication of two agents? I mean, how does that jive with what you're saying?
Right, right. So the conscious agent stuff. So Chris was the first author on our conscious agent networks paper, and that stuff is entirely outside of space time. Just because it's not quantum. As soon as you're dealing with quantum, now you're looking at the things from inside a headset perspective, right? So that's what the physicists, like the high energy physicists, are telling us. Space-time and quantum theory arise together, joined at the hip, from these deeper positive geometries. So when Chris is using quantum ideas, entanglement and so forth, then he's more looking at it from inside a headset perspective on things.
So then I ask about Susskind's notion of a quantum complexity and using circuit theory as a way of explaining and calculating the dissipation evolution of black holes. Is that similar to some of your concept?
It could be, because what we're saying is that it's going to be our analysis of what's causing black holes is going to be, the entropy rate of the signal that's coming through the channel exceeding the channel capacity. So it's going to be using that kind of language to understand what's happening inside these black holes.
Well, that's what he says. It's a computational framework. It's a communication computational framework. It's not just he's not computing a physical volume. It's like I went to a whole nother field, and he's what people are saying. Well, why you're going to a whole nother field? And then he talks about the structure of circuits, different kind of structure topology. I mean, it's like, I mean, this is very different than my high school physics.
That's right. And this whole approach with the conscious agent networks and channels and so forth, communication channels, could explain why Suskind's intuition to move in that direction might be on track.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah.
Again, I'm not saying, by the way, I should, humble pie is absolutely, I'm not saying we're right and this is the truth. I'm saying this is the next baby step.
I appreciate. I mean, this is all exploration, and it's explanatory richness. That when things fall into place the way they seem, I see them. I said, "There's something there." I mean,
it's pretty exciting. By the way, I should point out I get lots of emails from people who have questions that I can't answer. But there's one question I get a lot that I would just like to put out there so I can answer it for a lot of people. A lot of people go, look, if I put poison in your drink when you weren't looking, it would still kill you. So you didn't perceive it. So that means that the poison in the drink really was there and was real, and anything that you say can't convince me otherwise. So my reply is to answer any of these kinds of questions, always think about a virtual reality headset game where you're immersed in a VR and play the same thing in the VR and you will get the right answer. So for example, if I'm playing tennis, virtual reality tennis, and when I'm not looking, someone puts a tennis ball into the game where and I'm looking to the left, but they put the tennis ball to my right, and I don't see it. Well, is the tennis ball still there? Well, if I look over there, I'll see the tennis ball. So yes, only that there's a reality independent of that. The physical reality is the reality, like that there really is there is no real tennis ball there. The tennis ball only exists when I look because I rendered it in my headset. So what I'm saying is everything that you see inside space-time, you're rendering on the fly. The moon exists only when I perceive it. On this one, you have to go big or go home. You have to take the whole thing. The sun, moon, stars, space-time itself as data structures in you. They're your creation. Then you get the right answer. And most of us aren't willing to I'm just a tiny little object in space-time.
That's a big jump. And I want to ask you the other question. I had this. So you talked about and it was a response to Dawkins, a science of theology. And so and it was interesting that you said you agreed with him on that, and it said there should be a science of theology. And so how do you combine the two of those? Because in some sense, theology is traditionally about things that are non-material, and and so you're interfacing with a world that you can't fully understand. You're trying to influence, but there's something there that you will never understand, yet affects who you are, and so you're having to interface with something that's really not knowable, but you hope to be knowable. And it's just curious is when you put that into the kind of things that we're talking about outside space time. Well, I mean, what, and have a science of that. There's a different kind of conversation that's going on here that could be really interesting. And I just, what's your ideas on that?
It is interesting, and I'll just go in two different directions on that. First, I think the kind of thing that Dawkins would have in mind would be, of course, Dawkins doesn't believe that there's something beyond space-time,
Right,
including
right,
God.
exactly.
Right. So in that case, the kind of science and theology that I would think he would be entertaining would be what is the science of evolution that explains why we've evolved
Oh, I
these
see.
kinds of
I see.
ideas that
Yeah,
God
yeah,
is
not yet.
right, right. So
Yes,
he would
yes.
probably be
Yeah, yeah.
and also, by the way, probably he doesn't want to like debunk good morality. So he may want to, so how can we understand from an evolutionary point of view why we should, quote unquote, love our
Right,
neighbor as ourselves and do these other kinds of things. So can we, so and why not? Sure, why
right,
not?
right. Gotcha.
From now, my view of science of theology would be slightly different. I'm saying space-time isn't the fundamental reality. In fact, it's probably one of the more trivial of headsets that's possible.
But that seemed to be fundamental to our culture. I mean, we have a culture that's predicated on that. We have an Enlightenment rationalist culture that's predicated on that, right? I mean, I look at our social institutions and everything are predicated on that. I mean, and so it's sort of foundational. And when you change that, there's a huge investment in preserving that. I mean, that's fitness over truth in some sense. Anyway,
That's exactly right, and that's why I have no expectations in my lifetime for this being accepted. It's just too big a pill
well,
to swallow, right?
yeah,
So
yeah, no,
so you just have all you can do is do your work and do your work, and then eventually at some point the scientific evidence just becomes overwhelming, and you realize
well, you got me on that. I had a conversation with Carl about my background is interested in language and stuff, and he did a wonderful paper on I don't know if in communications and language and basically what you in linguistics does not really seem to pick this up. But when you have a pidgin language, when two people have never met before, they have these actions of exchange. They develop very sort of simple predicates about what things are, and they can elaborate it into a Creole and a full language. And it's sort of and Carl was showing the mechanisms how that happens. And if you can, and so you have an opportunity for different agents to create their own synthetic languages, basically. And one of the things we think is unique about human beings is we have a full expressive of a language. We can model things in that language and share those models between us. That may be one of the things we're interested in this whole group of working on this is observer languages. In other words, recognizing that you create different observer languages based on different observers that have different kind of syntax and semantics as a new medium that I mean, I think is going to come out of this. And so how do you talk about these things, right? I mean, how do you talk about these things? And you intentionally create a new kind of observer language. Yeah.
right. Well, I think this trace logic is the foundation of that.
That's what I was, yes.
That and the homomorphism onto the Lebesgue logic, because the Lebesgue logic is the logic of probabilistic reasoning. That is the logic of probabilistic reasoning, and the trace logic is the logic of observation. And we have a homomorphism. So this is really a framework for it. And then in the terms of language and the definition of terms in language, a lot of, as you well know, a lot of our terms are defined by ostensive definition, right? So at the right age, perhaps most listeners don't know what ostensive definition is, so I'll just say just a second. At the right age, Johnny is 18 months old, and mom and dad are ready to teach the word rabbit. And so Johnny's sitting on the floor, and there's a rabbit, and mom points and says, rabbit, and Johnny gets it at the right age. But that's actually a miracle, because that there are an infinite number of hypotheses that Johnny could be entertaining. It could be the left ear of the rabbit. It could be the tail. It could be the white color of the fur, or the furriness of the fur, or the left paw and the rug, or the nose and the pillow. I mean, there's an infinite number of hypotheses that Johnny could entail, and yet mom and dad know they can point and say rabbit, and they don't point and say mammal or quadruped. Right, we would laugh if they said quadruped first. That's you're not playing the language game right. So what's going on there is really interesting. We don't teach kids the word rabbit, what a rabbit is. They already know what a rabbit is. So all we do is we say, you see that thing over there that you already have? We call it a rabbit. All we're doing, the only thing we're doing is putting a little trivial word on it. All the other hard work has been done by the kid. And that's the case with basically all of our communication. If the person doesn't, I mean, I don't talk about math with my cats because they don't have the cognitive apparatus for it. Whereas I can with undergraduates, because, and it's not because I'm teaching them. If they don't have the innate ability, there's nothing I can do. So language really ends up being a set of ostensive definition pointers, basically, that we exchange.
But isn't it? But there's shared intention. I mean, it's interesting that if you mean have a bundle of shared intentions. In other words, if you look at pigeons, it's because people they're trying to do trade. They co-identify as the fact that they're trying to do a similar thing, so that the other person's like them. So when they post something like that, there's a shared intentionality that then they can generalize on. Now, if you talk about creating synthetics, maybe it's a question of creating those intentionalities that can be shared that then give language to it. I mean, I'm just curious how you see that potentially evolving or not.
Synthetics in the sense of new things that beyond
conscious
space-time.
agents talking to each other, creating their own language, and being able to then create and have different observational points of view. That you suddenly get this really rich, these diverse observational points of view and semantics based upon that, and you open up the space, the representational space, enormously.
Yes. Well, one thing that may come out of this is that if we have this one big stationary dynamics of consciousness, and then there's an infinite number of projections we could take, and in our little m equals 4 projection of space, four-dimensional space-time, Homo sapiens has English and Spanish and French and so forth as that. So that's the projection, and that's something you have to learn in time, right? A child has to learn it over time and so forth. So these different communication systems there's probably an infinite number of different ones, and the ones we're seeing here, as I mentioned, our headset is trivial. It's in the positive geometries, there's a parameter called m for amplitude-hedron, and for our space-time it's 4, so m equals 4. But m can be any integer you want, infinite. That's right. So we have one of the smaller numbers, right? Why not 4,000 or 4 billion? We have 4. So when we go there, John, then the languages that when m equals a billion instead of m equals 4, wow, what kind of languages are going to show up in that kind of projection? So I think that what you've raised will be endless exploration.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, I don't want to. This is a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know we're a little bit over, but it's really, and I hope we can continue. And I'm hoping for your success in rendering this, because we would be very interested. We want to have developers build things that do this and introduce this way of thinking into current institutional structures and how to think about. I mean, I'm very interested in climate change and how our models are off and things like. And I just think it's very powerful in a practical sense.
There's one thing I can point out that would be a help to me. I've got money for 2 postdocs right now. I've got the money. I need a recent PhD in algebraic geometry who knows high energy theoretical physics. So I've got 2 postdoc positions for that kind of person. So if anybody that you can point to me, so I've got the money. I just need. That's what we
That's
need
right.
because I want to go where you're talking about, John. That's
Okay,
where I want to go.
it's part of our interest. Make it happen. All right.
Yeah,
All right.
because then we have to go one step at a time. We
Yeah,
have to
no,
actually
no,
make
I
sure
know,
that the bridge is completely secure, and then we can start driving tanks over it.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Take care.